Today, we're going to talk about a side of the Third Reich that often gets overlooked. The women who were married to its most powerful and most monstrous leaders. And this isn't just about who they were, but really about the choices they made and the roles they played.
You know, this quote from the source material really hits the nail on the head. We have this common image of these women as maybe ignorant or coerced or just passive. But that idea just doesn't hold up. The reality, as we're about to see, is way more complex and a lot more disturbing.
So that's really the big question we're digging into today. Who were these women really? Were they just victims of their circumstances, or were they willing accomplices? To figure that out, we've got to peel back the layers of propaganda and look at their actual lives.
Okay, so first up, let's just tackle this myth of the passive partner head on. We're going to look at the evidence that shows these women were not on the sidelines at all, not even close. They were deeply, deeply embedded in the very fabric of the Nazi regime.
And what's so fascinating is how you can break down their roles. You had the true believers, the devoted ideologues, then you had the ambitious ones, the profiteers, who were living these incredibly lavish lives built on stolen wealth and just unimaginable human suffering. But the common thread? They were all active, and in many cases, fanatical supporters of the system.
All right, let's zoom in now to the absolute center of power. We're going to look at two women who are right there in Hitler's inner circle, and each of them represents a different kind of extreme ideological commitment that would, in the end, seal their fates.
We've got Eva Braun, Hitler's secret companion, whose devotion was a private affair. And then, on the complete other end of the spectrum, we have Magda Goebbels. She was the very public, very visible model of the perfect Nazi mother, whose fanaticism led to an absolutely unimaginable act.
Eva Braun's story is, well, it's a strange one. She meets Hitler when she's only 17 years old. He's 40. For over a decade, she's his companion, but her entire existence is a state secret. The German public had no idea who she was, all to protect Hitler's image as this leader who was, married to Germany. She even attempted suicide twice, not out of some moral crisis, but as desperate bids for his attention. She was essentially the invisible first lady at his mountain retreat, the Berghof, hosting parties but having no real power or public profile whatsoever.
This timeline, wow, it just lays out the whole tragic arc of her loyalty. After all those years in the shadows, her story ends in the bunker under Berlin, with Soviet troops literally blocks away. She finally gets to marry Hitler, getting that official status she always wanted. And less than 40 hours later, they were both dead. She took cyanide, choosing to die with him rather than live in a world without him.
Now let's turn to Magda Goebbels. If Eva was Hitler's romantic partner, Magda was described as his spiritual soulmate. She was the picture of the ideal Nazi woman. Elegant, cultured, she marries the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and becomes this huge figure in Nazi high society. Her devotion to Hitler was just absolute. So much so that all 6 of her children with Joseph were given names that started with H in his honor. And this right here, this is the horrifying conclusion of that fanaticism. As Berlin was falling, she was offered chance after chance to get her children out to safety. She refused every single one. Her reasoning? She said she couldn't imagine them living in a world without National Socialism. So in the final hours, she calmly, methodically murdered all 6 of them before walking up to the garden with her husband to commit suicide. It's just a chilling, calculated act born from pure, unadulterated ideology.
Okay, let's shift our focus a bit. We're going to talk about 2 other women now. They might have been less ideologically central than someone like Magda Goebbels, but they were absolutely key beneficiaries of the regime. This is where we'll see how they reap these enormous material rewards from the regime's crimes, creating lives of pure luxury built on a foundation of terror.
So here, we're going to compare Emmy Goering, the super flamboyant, unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich, with Margarita Himmler, whose complicity came from a much more isolated and, well, emotionally distant place.
Emmy Goering was an actress who married the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, and she lived a life of almost unimaginable luxury. I mean, we're talking lavish parties at these huge estates that were filled with priceless masterpieces of art, all of it stolen from Jewish collectors and museums across Europe. She wore confiscated jewels and dined on the finest food, totally insulated from the suffering that made her entire lifestyle possible.
And here's the thing. Emmy wasn't just enjoying the perks. She was fiercely protective of her status. This quote shows her intense rivalry with Eva Braun. Emmy saw herself as the real First Lady, and she refused to even acknowledge Hitler's hidden companion.
It just shows how deeply invested she was in the regime's power structure and her own place right at the top of it. Margareta Himmler's story is quite different, and it's a lot more complex. She was married to the head of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust, Heinrich Himmler, and she was an early and enthusiastic supporter with strong anti-Semitic beliefs of her own. Now, their marriage pretty much disintegrated as his power grew. He ended up starting a whole other family with his secretary, leaving Margareta very isolated. But she was far from an innocent victim. She managed their family estate, a home that had been confiscated from its Jewish owner, and profited from her husband's position, all while he was orchestrating genocide on an industrial scale.
So what happened to these women when the whole regime they supported and benefited from finally came crashing down? Well, in this next section, we're going to see how their paths diverge in some really dramatic ways after the war, leading to a pretty stark reckoning for each of them.
This table really just lays it all out so clearly. The ideologues, Braun and Goebbels, chose death rather than face a world without their Führer. But the beneficiaries, well, they faced a different kind of justice. Emmy Goering served a year in prison. Margareta Himmler, meanwhile, was classified as a lesser offender and largely escaped any personal accountability for her husband's monstrous crime.
For the survivors, their final years were a dramatic fall from grace. Both Emmy Goering and Margaret Himmler lived the rest of their lives in relative poverty and obscurity, a world away from the palaces and stolen art. And crucially, both of them spent decades denying they had any knowledge of the Holocaust, clinging to this narrative of ignorance right to the very end.
And that brings us to our final section, and really, the most important question of all. Why do these stories still matter today? The answer, I think, lies in what they teach us about the nature of complicity, and about the quiet choices that can enable great evil.
The definition itself is so simple, but it's incredibly powerful. Complicity isn't just about pulling the trigger yourself, it's also about supporting, enabling, and benefiting from a system that does. And this, right here, this is the key takeaway. These women had agency. They weren't just passive victims swept up by history. No, at every single turn, they made conscious choices to align themselves with a monstrous system.
They made the choice to embrace the ideology. They made the choice to live in luxury on the spoils of theft and murder. They chose to raise their children to worship a genocidal regime. And ultimately, when it really mattered, they chose loyalty to their husbands and their leader over basic human morality.
This quote from the source material just perfectly encapsulates the lesson here. Their lives are a potent and, frankly, uncomfortable warning. They show us how ordinary people can become entangled in and supportive of extraordinary evil.
And so we're left with a powerful realization. The stories of these women demonstrate that evil isn't defined just by monstrous acts. It's also defined by thousands of smaller choices. The choice to support, to benefit, and ultimately to look away. Their lives really make you ask that tough question. Where do we draw the line?